All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Brian Doyle. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Ward 3 Education Network. We're very, very happy to have Maggie Giese here tonight. She's a licensed clinical social worker from Georgetown Psychology, and here to just sort of talk about um, parenting, what I'll call parenting in stressful times. And I don't think I need to introduce sort of why particular times are stressful for many in our school communities. Um, with that, I will turn it over to her. She's going to talk some slides. We'll talk a little bit about giving us all some advice, both for ourselves and for our kids. And then she'll take some questions. So with that, Maggie, thank you so
Yeah,
much.
hi everyone. My name's Maggie. So grateful to be here with all of you. Let me just go ahead and share my screen and then we'll kind of get into it here. All right, everyone can see that and everyone can hear me. Okay, I assume. Yes.
Yes.
Awesome.
Both.
Okay, awesome. So again, my name is Maggie Giese. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and just really happy to be here to have this conversation with you all about how to kind of manage the stress that we are feeling, that kids are feeling right now, and how to support each other through it. We're definitely seeing it in our practice. I work with kids, parents, and everything in between. So we're seeing it kind of at all levels, all developmental stages, unfortunately. And so I think it's really good to just be talking about, what do we do and how do we support each other through it. So I have a presentation, like Brian said, but if anyone has kind of a burning question while I'm presenting, feel free to just unmute yourself and let me know. Otherwise, we'll have plenty of time, sounds like, for questions afterwards. All right, so just wanted to start with some statistics on mental health for our youth. We obviously know that, post-pandemic, we saw increased rates of mental health disorders in our youth, particularly in our teens, increased rates of anxiety and depression. As many as, 40% of our US high school students reported feeling persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness over the last year. That was just as recent as 2023. And, we're seeing higher rates of thoughts of suicide. We obviously know that our LGBTQ plus youth are at an even greater risk of experiencing serious thoughts of suicide. And so when we, consider the mental health challenges that many of our children and teens are already facing, and then we kind of add in new stressors and the chronic stress that many are experiencing right now over the last few months, it can really exacerbate some of the challenges that our kids are already facing. So just kind of wanted to give a brief overview of what some of these signs of stress might be that you're seeing in your kids, in your students, and maybe yourselves as well. And when we talk about stress, obviously there's different kinds of stress. We have the good stress that helps us be productive and motivated. We have that acute stress that kind of comes and goes. Maybe someone's stressed about a test or something like that. But I think what we're all talking about right now is chronic stress, right? This kind of prolonged period of stress through transition or uncertainty for whatever variety of reasons, depending on your particular circumstance. And that can feel really, really overwhelming. So that can obviously manifest in a lot of different ways. We have the physical symptoms and signs, right? Whether that's some kind of sleep disruption, an increase or decrease in appetite, restlessness, right? Or other kind of physical pains. So headaches, stomach pains, you might hear of kids that are starting to report more headaches or more stomach aches or going to the nurse more, or your kids coming home more often with pains. That could absolutely be a signal, right, of the stress that they're experiencing in their system, and it's having a kind of somatic response. We, of course, know about all the emotional signs that people can experience from the stress. So anxiety and worry, depressive symptoms, thoughts of suicide, feeling really hopeless, or guilt or shame. And then we have the behavioral science, right? So For some of us, it, might mean we're more emotionally reactive, or you might be seeing more irritability in your kid or more anger, right? Some people tend to kind of withdraw from their relationships or start to isolate more. Um, some might, see a difficulty in concentrating or forgetfulness, right? So the avoidance of tasks. Those are kind of some really big ones, right, to be definitely looking out for in our kids and our teens, particularly for kids who are already struggling with things like ADHD or anxiety, right? And then you add in all this extra stress, and it can, like I said, really exacerbate some of those signs. Struggle to make decisions, right? Um, Increased consumption of alcohol or drugs, or kind of, watching excessive amounts of TV, or not being able to kind of turn the news off. Those are all the different signs, and there's many, many more, obviously. But just kind of want to normalize that these things are happening, right? We might be experiencing them, and you definitely are probably seeing them in your kids. So I just wanted to kind of further illustrate, what this means when we have stress in our lives, particularly a chronic stressor, like what's happening right now in our communities. We have a window of tolerance, right? So in our window of tolerance, that's kind of that optimal zone of arousal where we can function our best, right, in everyday life. So in a perfect world, we'd always all be in our window of tolerance where we're, able to access both our reason and our emotion, right? We're really motivated, productive, mentally engaged. But of course, when some kind of trauma or stressor comes into our life that we're exposed to, it moves us out of our window of tolerance, right? And that can happen really quickly. That's when you start to see that either fight, flight, or freeze, right? So we can be moved into a state of hyper arousal, right? Which is where you might be, more emotionally distressed, more reactive, having a hard time calming down, having a hard time, thinking clearly. For some people, they go into hypoarousal, where they shut down, right? So they become more depressed, lethargic, numb, or apathetic. So, and sometimes you might be in both at different times, depending on what's going on. The good news is that there are lots of ways to increase our window of tolerance and to get back into our window of tolerance. And so we'll start to kind of talk about some of those ways as we keep going here. So let's talk some strategies. Obviously, first and foremost, we know talking to kids is so, so important, right? Providing a really intentional and consistent time for connection where kids can ask questions, where they can express, their emotions, their fears, their concerns. Obviously, this is going to be dependent in terms of what specifically you're talking about on the age of the kid and what's kind of appropriate for them developmentally. For our teens, they and our adolescents, they're definitely being exposed to a lot more, right? So they're hearing about it at school. They, might be noticing the divisiveness that is happening in communities, right? Or seeing different situations with their friends, right? Or they themselves are in a situation, right, where a parent just lost a job. So they're definitely more exposed. And then we also have social media, where they are seeing and hearing a lot of things. And so you can have, more direct conversations with them, right? As it feels appropriate, as they bring things up, but also setting aside time as a family to regularly check in, right? Um, and regardless, right? So even for the younger kids who hopefully, we want to shield them from a lot of what is happening before they're able to fully understand it, but they can still feel the stress, right? And they might not fully understand what's going on, but they're feeling some kind of distress. So just being able to check in with them, right? Validating their emotions, normalizing what they're experiencing, right? So reflecting back what you hear them saying, what you feel that they're experiencing before you kind of jump into any kind of problem solving, right? Um, Particularly for kids who are experiencing anxiety, right, or are more prone to anxiety, when you validate their emotion, it's also really helpful to include some kind of confidence building statement after that, right? So I know that you're really scared right now. And I also know that we're going to get through this as a family, right? Just as an example. So helping kind of assure them that you've got them, that we're going to get this figured out together, even when things are uncertain. And remembering too that we don't need to have all the answers. I think that, I have to remind myself of that all the time too, just even as a clinician. We don't have all the answers, particularly right now when things are constantly changing and so much is unknown and so much is uncertain. And so what matters more than anything is that you're just present with your kid, right? That you're checking in with them regularly. And that even if they don't want to talk in that moment, especially for those teenagers, they're kind of touch and go, that you can be a safe space for them. So just reminding them that when you're ready to talk, I'll be here, right? And taking advantage of those moments where maybe it's more informal, right? Those side by side moments where you're in the car together or you're walking the dog together, where you can take some of the pressure off for them to have to kind of have that formal eye contact and conversation, but you can still really have that connection. Creating separation. This is a tough one, but where possible, how can you limit not only your kids' consumption of the news and social media, but your own, right? Um, we're all trying to find that balance between staying informed, right, and not becoming kind of obsessive about what's happening when really, literally, things are changing by the hour, by the minute, right? A lot of the time. And so how do we manage that, right? So for our kids, there's maybe you have to kind of sit down as a family and reprioritize, screen time, right? Or is the news on in the background all the time at your house? Can you turn that off, right? Can you guys have time where there's no screens at all, no phones? So just kind of figuring out what works for your family, but kind of checking in, right? And reflecting on how much time am I spending, you know, checking my email, checking my phone, to kind of create that separation as much as possible. And then intentionally shifting gears before you walk in your house, I think that's a really big one. Um, can you figure out a way, particularly when you're going into a stressful environment every day, or you had a really, tough encounter at work or something else came up, you come in and that stress kind of bleeds into the house, right, into our families. And it's understandable, we all do it, but having ways to intentionally shift gears, having some kind of ritual, right? Maybe you have a way to kind of decompress on your drive home, or it might just be as simple as, for 2 to 5 minutes before you walk in your house, you're, you know, taking a deep breath or, saying a prayer or whatever kind of works for you to kind of regulate. It doesn't mean that you can't feel your stress, but it means that you have to figure out a way to regulate so that when you come in, you can be present, right, with your family and with your kids. So finding time to connect in other ways as well during this time can be so helpful, right? When everything is chaotic and busy and stressful, we can kind of lose sight of that quality time as a family. And that is so important to maintain, right? To create those traditions. Maybe you have a family movie night or a game night, right? Ways to kind of laugh together. That can also be really helpful for our stress. And then taking time to discuss and revisit your family values. This can be really, really grounding for not just kids, but for the adults in the family as well, right? Sitting down and saying, okay, what do we care about as a family, right? When everything else is chaotic and stressful and scary, let's come back and remember what we care about, right? And then how do we live that out, right? So maybe you decide as a family you want to go volunteer somewhere, or, there's little ways that you want to show kindness to others if you really care and value kindness as a family. So it can be a really fun way to kind of reconnect and remind ourselves of, not only our values, but also our strengths. Sticking to routine, this is a big one. Kids really need routine and structure and boundaries to feel safe and secure. And I want to acknowledge that when things are chaotic or someone's in a period of loss or transition or chronic stress, routine can oftentimes be, right, like one of the first things to go. And so, what is in your control to kind of recreate that structure or maintain it, right? It might not be everything is the same as it was, but what are small ways, right? What is my What is our bedtime routine? What is our routine for coming together as a family, right? How can we, maybe you have to sit down, right, and reprioritize, have a family meeting and say, okay, I know we've kind of fallen off track, but let's figure out how we can come back together. Maybe it's a visual schedule, right? But having that consistency and that structure is really, really stabilizing for kids and helps make them feel safe, and it really reduces their own anxiety. And then modeling. So for parents, being able to model your own healthy coping skills, to model your own emotional regulation is so important for your kids to see. And it's definitely not easy, but it's worth it, right? It's worth it to figure out like what isn't working for me and where can I make some changes in my own routine so that I can be there for my kids, right? So when you model healthy coping skills, you show your kids how to do the same. When you model regulation in yourself, you show them that not only are their emotions not too big for you, right? Like you're saying, I can handle your emotions, but you're also saying I can handle my own emotions, right? And so, and you can even have these conversations together as a family about how to take care of ourselves. And you can be a human. It doesn't mean that you're not meant to express your emotions, and you can talk about some of the stress you're feeling, but it's about how you do it, right? And it's about having some strategies that you're modeling to your kids to manage it. And so just some kind of brief and basic ways to do this, right? Nothing that's revolutionary here, but just some good reminders for all of us. How do we reset, right? It's really important to allow the body to complete its stress response cycle. If it doesn't, that's when we get stuck, right? And we get into those phases of, resistance where we're becoming really irritable and frustrated and not able to kind of do what we want to do, or have that kind of prolonged exhaustion. So things like getting really good sleep, right? Finding time for downtime and relaxation, regular exercise, laughing is a big one, or crying, or both, right? So that emotional release is really, really helpful. Any kind of directed attention activity, so spending time in nature or reading for fun, right? Or any kind of creative expression, those can all be ways to help your body reset. And then taking time to process, right? So both in the short term, right? When let's say you have a really stressful encounter at work and you're you're dysregulated, right? So what can you do in that moment to regulate your nervous system, right? Discharging the stress in some way through physical movement is pretty much always going to be really, really helpful. And it might just be that you only have time to go to the bathroom and walk it out, right? And splash some cold water on your face, or, maybe you take 3 deep breaths in your office and you plant your feet on the ground and you stay really grounded, but really finding some ways to do that for yourself. And then seeking outside support, right? For that more long-term and regular processing. And that may be for yourself, but also for your kids, right? Reaching out to your support networks, finding a support group. Um, it's worth it. And I know we're obviously seeing the impacts and seeing more people wanting to get into therapy right now because they're struggling, right? And there's nothing wrong with saying to your kids, I'm going to get into therapy because I'm noticing that I need some support, right? And maybe they don't feel ready to do that, but you're modeling it. And then meditation or mindfulness practice. I won't spend too much time talking about mindfulness because it could be like its whole own presentation about how helpful it is. But finding different ways to be present in the moment, right? Different strategies for grounding yourself can be really, really soothing and help regulate your nervous system. And then just generally, right, figuring out again, what are your coping strategies? What are your ways to incorporate regular self-care? So I think the word self-care, it can kind of get a bad rep because people are like, I don't have time for self-care. I can't get a massage every week, or, it's expensive. I'm just trying to basically survive. But it can be really basic, and I always tell people to kind of treat it like a menu and go for, the low bearing fruit, right? So in the next slide, I have some examples here of how to look at it from a holistic perspective, but not just tending to kind of the basics in your physical health, but your emotional self-care, right? Whether that's spending time with family or identifying other kind of comforting activities or people in your life, right? Finding time to be reflective, finding a spiritual practice, and a professional self-care as well, right? So how can you maintain boundaries, find that work-life balance, etc. So that's kind of where I will leave it. That's all I have for today. On the next page here, I have my email and a QR code if anyone is interested in seeking support from our practice in particular. And we also offer a free parent series every month where it's just kind of a, 12 to 1 lunch and learn. And we cover different topics to help parents with these kinds of issues and conversations. So please feel free to access that or reach out if you would like more information. So I will open it up for questions. Brian, happy